Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a pioneering voice for justice who became one of the most influential African American writers and activists of the 19th century. Frances Harper, a poet, novelist, lecturer, and reformer, was born free in Baltimore, Maryland on September 24, 1825. She came from humble beginnings but possessed extraordinary talent. Harper had a dignified presence and commanding oratorical skills. Her intellectual achievements were remarkable. She was educated at her uncle's academy for free black children until the age of 13, when she left school to work as a domestic servant. Then in 1850, her uncle William Watkins, an influential abolitionist and educator, helped shape her worldview. The young Harper inherited a legacy of activism and a commitment to social justice that would define her entire life. Frances Harper was witness to the brutality of slavery. She saw the auction blocks and the suffering of enslaved people in Baltimore, a city on the border between freedom and bondage. In 1850, when Maryland passed a law that threatened free black people with enslavement if they entered the state, Harper, who had been teaching in Ohio, found herself unable to return to her birthplace. She was driven from her home by unjust laws. Harper began her career as a teacher in Ohio and Pennsylvania. She taught at Union Seminary near Columbus and later in Pennsylvania. After Maryland's oppressive legislation made her an exile from her native state, she sought a position that would allow her to fight against slavery more directly. She was transformed by the injustice she witnessed. In 1853, Harper published her first collection of poetry, and within a year she had become a traveling lecturer for the Maine Anti-Slavery Society. Harper was not a passive observer or a quiet voice in the movement. She was a fierce advocate who traveled throughout the northern states delivering passionate speeches against slavery and for women's rights. She was a more committed radical than many of her contemporaries. In September 1854, Harper delivered her first major lecture, and within months she had become one of the most sought-after speakers on the abolitionist circuit. Harper was literally the woman who traveled from town to town, from church to church, ready to challenge the conscience of the nation. In 1860, Harper's reputation as a speaker and writer had grown immensely. She had published multiple poetry collections and her work was widely read in abolitionist circles. But as the nation moved towards civil war, Harper intensified her efforts. Frances Harper spoke battle after battle in the court of public opinion, and she never retreated from her principles. She always lived to fight for justice another day. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Harper traveled constantly. Frances Harper was a tireless warrior when she crossed state lines to speak in hostile territories. She was using the power of words and moral persuasion to awaken consciences, and no one was expecting the impact she would have. Harper's poetry resonated with audiences across racial lines. Her verses were published in abolitionist newspapers and read at anti-slavery meetings. Following the publication of her most famous poems was a period of intense activism for Harper. The pre-war years were a crucial time. That turbulent period they were fighting for freedom with words and deeds. Harper's strategy was all about reaching hearts and minds and making people confront the evil of slavery for another generation. The Civil War began in April 1861, and Harper continued her work throughout the conflict. With the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the war's purpose was clarified, and Harper saw her life's work beginning to bear fruit. In 1865, with the war over and slavery abolished, Harper did not go home to rest. Harper was pulled back into the political struggle, back into the work of Reconstruction where the nation was attempting to carve out a new social order, and she agreed to continue her activism to help unify and uplift the newly freed people. On November 22, 1860, Frances Harper married Fenton Harper, a widower with 3 children. Frances Harper was one of the few prominent activists who managed to balance marriage and motherhood with her public work. Harper lived on a farm in Ohio with her husband and raised their daughter Mary. She continued to write during this period, though her speaking engagements were reduced. When her husband died in 1864, leaving her in difficult financial circumstances, Harper returned to the lecture circuit with renewed determination. After the Civil War, Harper traveled throughout the South, speaking to newly freed African Americans about education, temperance, and moral uplift. She understood that for the formerly enslaved to truly achieve freedom and for there to be real equality and not just legal emancipation, there had to be education, economic opportunity, and political power. She had to set the example of the activist who continues the struggle even after the immediate goal is achieved. Harper spent years traveling through southern states, often under difficult and dangerous conditions. In 1866, Harper delivered speeches in 11 states. She spoke at churches, schools, and public halls. Her message was one of hope but also of hard work and self-determination. Harper believed deeply in the capacity of African Americans to rise and prosper if given the opportunity. She also believed in the importance of women's rights and became increasingly involved in the women's suffrage movement. Harper was a bridge between the abolitionist movement and the emerging movements for civil rights and women's equality. Frances Harper understood intersectionality before the term existed. She recognized that the struggles of Black Americans and women were interconnected. She spoke eloquently about the double burden faced by Black women who suffered discrimination based on both race and gender. In 1866, at the National Women's Rights Convention, Harper delivered a powerful speech titled "We Are All Bound Up Together," in which she articulated this vision of interconnected struggles. She challenged white feminists to consider the specific challenges faced by Black women. Harper's activism was not limited to speeches. She was a prolific writer throughout her life. Her poetry collection sold thousands of copies, making her one of the best-selling African American poets of the 19th century. Her most famous poem, "Bury Me in a Free Land," expressed her anguish over slavery and her determination never to rest in a land where people were enslaved. The poem was widely reprinted and became an anthem for the abolitionist cause. Harper also wrote short stories and essays that appeared in newspapers and magazines throughout the country. In 1869, Harper attended the American Equal Rights Association meeting where the movement split over the question of whether to support the 15th Amendment, which would grant voting rights to Black men but not to women. Harper sided with those who supported the amendment, arguing that Black men's enfranchisement was urgently needed and that women's suffrage could be pursued alongside it. This position put her at odds with some white feminists, including Susan B. A. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who opposed the amendment because it did not include women. Harper's position reflected her understanding that for Black communities, the immediate need for political power was paramount. Harper continued her activism through the 1870s and 1880s. She joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union and became superintendent of its colored section. She traveled extensively, speaking about temperance, which she saw as a moral and social issue that particularly affected Black communities. Harper believed that alcohol abuse contributed to poverty and domestic violence, and she saw temperance as part of a broader program of moral and social uplift. Her work with the WCTU brought her into contact with white reformers, and she consistently challenged them to address racial prejudice within their own ranks. In 1892, at the age of 67, Harper published her most ambitious work, the novel Iola Lee Roy, or Shadows Uplifted. The novel told the story of a light-skinned Black woman who discovers her African American heritage and chooses to identify with and work for the uplift of Black people. The novel was groundbreaking in its portrayal of Black characters as intelligent, moral, and capable. It challenged the racist stereotypes that dominated American literature at the time. Iola Lee Roy was one of the first novels published by an African American woman, and it sold well, reaching both Black and white audiences. The novel's heroine, Iola Lee Roy, embodied many of Harper's own values. She was educated, principled, and committed to racial uplift. She rejected the opportunity to pass as white and instead chose to work as a teacher and activist in Black communities. Through Iola's story, Harper explored themes of identity, racial pride, and social responsibility. The novel also addressed the sexual exploitation of enslaved women and the complex family relationships that resulted from slavery's legacy. Harper used fiction to educate readers about the realities of slavery and its aftermath. Harper's literary style was accessible and moralistic. She wrote to instruct and inspire rather than simply to entertain. Her poetry often employed simple rhyme schemes and straightforward language, making it easy to memorize and recite. This accessibility was deliberate. Harper wanted her work to reach ordinary people, not just educated elites. Her poems were read aloud at meetings and gatherings, and they were effective tools for spreading abolitionist and reform messages. Harper understood the power of literature as a vehicle for social change. Throughout the 1890s and into the early 20th century, Harper remained active despite advancing age. She continued to write and speak, though less frequently than in her younger years. She was involved in the founding of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896 and served as a vice president of the organization. The NACW brought together black women's clubs from across the country to work for racial uplift, education, and social reform. Harper's involvement reflected her lifelong commitment to organized activism and her belief in the power of black women to effect change. Harper also remained involved in the struggle for women's suffrage. She attended suffrage conventions and continued to advocate for voting rights for all women. She challenged the racism within the suffrage movement and insisted that black women's voices be heard. Harper understood that political power was essential for achieving social change, and she worked to ensure that black women would be included in the expansion of democratic rights. Her persistence in the face of discrimination from white suffragists demonstrated her commitment to both racial and gender justice. In her later years, Harper lived in Philadelphia, where she had settled after the Civil War. She remained intellectually active, writing poetry and essays and corresponding with other reformers. She was respected as an elder stateswoman of the reform movements, and younger activists sought her counsel and support. Harper had witnessed tremendous change in her lifetime, from the height of slavery to its abolition, from the complete disenfranchisement of black Americans to the promise of citizenship rights, from the exclusion of women from public life to the emergence of a powerful women's movement. Harper's personal life was marked by both joy and sorrow. She had a close relationship with her daughter Mary, who survived to adulthood and married. Harper also maintained friendships with other activists and writers, including William Still, the noted conductor on the Underground Railroad, and other prominent figures in the abolitionist and reform movements. She corresponded with Frederick Douglass and other leaders of the black community. These relationships sustained her through decades of demanding work and provided networks of support for her activism. Harper's religious faith was central to her identity and her activism. She was a devout Christian who saw her reform work as a religious calling. Her poetry and speeches frequently invoke biblical themes and language. She believed that Christianity, properly understood, demanded social justice and equality. She challenged Christians who supported slavery or discrimination, arguing that they had betrayed the fundamental teachings of their faith. Harper's religious conviction gave her strength and moral authority in her advocacy. Harper's economic philosophy emphasized self-help and mutual aid within black communities. She believed that African Americans needed to develop their own economic institutions and support black-owned businesses. She encouraged thrift, hard work, and education as paths to economic advancement. At the same time, she recognized that systemic racism created barriers to black economic progress, and she advocated for government policies that would provide support and opportunity. Harper's economic views reflected the complex reality of black life in post-emancipation America. Harper was also concerned with issues of health and hygiene in black communities. She spoke about the importance of sanitation, proper nutrition, and access to medical care. She recognized that poverty and discrimination contributed to poor health outcomes, and she worked to educate communities about practices that could improve health. This aspect of her activism reflected the broad scope of her concern for black welfare and her understanding that uplift required attention to all aspects of life. Harper's legacy as a writer has been increasingly recognized in recent decades. Literary scholars have rediscovered her work and placed it in the canon of American literature. Her novel Iola Leroy is now widely taught in universities, and her poetry is anthologized in collections of African American and women's literature. Scholars have analyzed her use of language, her narrative strategies, and her engagement with the literary conventions of her time. Harper is now recognized as a pioneering figure in African American literature and a significant voice in 19th-century American letters. Harper's activism also left a lasting legacy. She helped establish patterns of organizing and advocacy that would be continued by later generations of black activists. Her work with women's clubs presaged the club movement that would become so important in black communities in the early 20th century. Her insistence on addressing both racial and gender discrimination anticipated the intersectional approaches of later feminists. Harper's example of lifelong commitment to justice inspired countless others to take up the struggle. On February 22, 1911, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper died in Philadelphia at the age of 85. She had lived through the most transformative period in American history, from slavery to freedom, from exclusion to the promise of citizenship. When she died, she left behind a body of work that testified to her talent and her commitment. She left a legacy of activism that had touched thousands of lives. Harper was eulogized as a pioneer and a prophet, a woman who had dedicated her life to the cause of justice. Harper's funeral was attended by prominent members of Philadelphia's black community and by representatives of the various reform organizations with which she had been associated. Tributes poured in from across the country, recognizing her contributions to literature and reform. Newspapers published obituaries that celebrated her achievements and mourned her passing. The outpouring of grief and respect demonstrated the impact she had had on her contemporaries. Frances Harper's life spanned a period of tremendous change in American society. She was born into a nation where slavery was legal and where free black people faced severe restrictions on their rights and opportunities. She died in a nation where slavery had been abolished and where black Americans, though still facing discrimination and violence, had achieved citizenship and the vote. Harper had been a witness to this transformation, but more than that, she had been an agent of change. Through her writing and her activism, she had helped to bring about the world she envisioned. Harper's intersectional approach to activism set her apart from many of her contemporaries. While some activists focused exclusively on racial justice or on women's rights, Harper understood that these struggles were interconnected. She recognized that black women faced unique challenges and that their liberation required attention to both race and gender. This insight made her a more effective advocate and a more inclusive leader. Her ability to build coalitions across different reform movements demonstrated her political skill and her commitment to comprehensive social change. Harper's literary achievements were remarkable for her time. As an African American woman in the 19th century, she faced enormous barriers to publication and recognition. Yet she managed to publish numerous books of poetry, a novel, short stories, and essays. Her work reached a wide audience and influenced public opinion on the crucial issues of her day. Harper proved that black women could be successful writers and intellectuals, challenging the racist and sexist assumptions of her society. Harper's speaking career was equally impressive. She traveled thousands of miles, often under difficult conditions, to deliver her message. She spoke to audiences large and small, in churches, schools, and public halls. Her oratorical skills were widely praised, and she was known for her ability to move audiences to tears and to action. Harper's speeches combined moral passion with careful argument, emotional appeal with factual evidence. She was a master of rhetoric who used her gifts to advance the cause of justice. Harper's commitment to education reflected her belief in the transformative power of knowledge. She had been fortunate to receive an education at her uncle's academy, and she understood how education had opened opportunities for her. She worked throughout her life to expand educational opportunities for black Americans, teaching in schools, advocating for public education, and encouraging young people to pursue learning. Harper believed that education was essential for individual advancement and for the progress of the race as a whole. Harper's temperance advocacy, while sometimes viewed critically by modern scholars, reflected her concern for the welfare of black families and communities. She saw alcohol abuse as a contributor to poverty, domestic violence, and social disorder. Her work with the temperance movement brought her into contact with reform networks that she used to advance other causes as well. Harper's temperance advocacy was part of her broader vision of moral and social uplift, a vision that emphasized personal responsibility alongside social reform. Harper's relationship with white reformers was complex. She worked alongside white abolitionists and suffragists, but she also challenged their racism and insisted on equal treatment. She refused to be patronized or to accept a subordinate role in reform movements. Harper's dignity and self-respect commanded respect from her white colleagues, even when they disagreed with her. Her ability to work across racial lines while maintaining her principles demonstrated her political acumen and her strength of character. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was even in death a unifying figure, a woman who had bridged divides and brought people together in common cause. Her life's work had been dedicated to creating a more just and equal society, and she had made significant progress toward that goal. Though the full realization of her vision would require the work of many more generations, Harper had laid important groundwork and had inspired countless others to continue the struggle. Her legacy endures in the ongoing movements for racial and gender justice, in the literature she created, and in the example she set of a life dedicated to principle and to service. Salmon P. Chase was an Ohio lawyer and statesman who became one of the most influential figures in 19th-century American politics. Salmon Portland Chase, the 6th Chief Justice of the United States, was born in Cornish, New Hampshire on January 13, 1808. He came from a family of modest means. Chase had an imposing physical presence and a commanding personality. His early life was marked by tragedy and hardship. He was homeschooled and attended local academies until his father's death when Chase was just 9 years old. The young boy was sent to live with his uncle, Philander Chase, an Episcopal bishop in Ohio. Under his uncle's strict tutelage, Chase received a classical education. He attended Cincinnati College briefly before enrolling at Dartmouth College in 1824. Chase graduated from Dartmouth in 1826 and then moved to Washington, D.C. to study law while supporting himself as a school teacher. Salmon Chase was admitted to the bar in 1829 and established his legal practice in Cincinnati, Ohio. Within a few years he had built a successful law practice and was gaining recognition in legal circles. In 1834, Chase married Catherine Jane Garnes, but tragedy struck when she died in 1835, just months after their wedding. Chase remarried in 1839 to Eliza Ann Smith, but she too died in 1845. Chase would marry once more in 1846 to Sarah Bell Ludlow, who died in 1852. These personal tragedies deeply affected Chase throughout his life, leaving him to raise his daughters alone. Despite these losses, Chase threw himself into his legal work and political activism. Chase became deeply involved in the anti-slavery movement in the 1830s. He defended fugitive slaves in court without charging fees, earning him the nickname Attorney General for runaway Negroes. Chase believed slavery was morally wrong and unconstitutional. He argued that the Constitution did not protect slavery in federal territories and that the federal government had the power and duty to restrict its expansion. His legal arguments in defense of fugitive slaves and abolitionists made him famous throughout the North. Chase was not initially a radical abolitionist like William Lloyd Garrison, who demanded immediate emancipation. He was more moderate, believing in gradual emancipation and colonization schemes. But over time, Chase's views evolved and he became more committed to ending slavery wherever it existed. In 1841, Chase helped establish the Liberty Party, a third party dedicated to anti-slavery principles. The Liberty Party was the first political party in America to make opposition to slavery its central platform. Chase drafted the party's platform and became one of its leading voices. The Liberty Party never achieved major electoral success, but it helped bring anti-slavery politics into the mainstream. Chase understood that for the anti-slavery movement to succeed, it needed to work within the existing political system. He was a pragmatic politician who knew how to build coalitions and compromise when necessary. In 1849, Chase was elected to the United States Senate from Ohio as a Free Soil Democrat. The Free Soil Party opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Chase aligned himself with this movement, believing that containing slavery geographically would eventually lead to its extinction. As a senator, Chase was an outspoken critic of the Compromise of 1850, which he believed made too many concessions to slaveholding interests. He particularly opposed the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens to assist in capturing escaped slaves. Chase argued that this law violated the Constitution and individual liberty. He became one of the leading anti-slavery voices in the Senate. During his Senate term, Chase worked tirelessly to build a new political coalition that could effectively oppose slavery's expansion. He corresponded with politicians across the North, urging them to unite against the slave power. Chase was instrumental in the formation of the Republican Party in the mid-1850s. The Republican Party brought together former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats under one banner. Their platform was straightforward: no expansion of slavery into the territories. Chase helped draft the Republican Party's principles and strategy. He saw the Republican Party as the vehicle through which anti-slavery politics could finally achieve national power. In 1855, Chase was elected governor of Ohio, serving 2 terms until 1860. As governor, Chase worked to improve public education, reform the state's criminal justice system, and promote economic development. He also used his position to advance anti-slavery causes. Chase refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in Ohio, arguing that state officials had no obligation to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. This stance made him extremely popular among anti-slavery voters but also created tensions with the federal government. Chase believed that states had the right to resist federal laws they deemed unconstitutional or immoral. Chase harbored presidential ambitions throughout the 1850s. He sought the Republican nomination in 1856 but lost to John C. Fremont. Chase tried again in 1860, believing he was the natural choice to lead the Republican Party. He had been fighting slavery longer than most Republicans and had the credentials and experience for the presidency. But Chase faced strong competition from William Seward of New York and Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Chase's support collapsed after the first ballot. Lincoln emerged as a compromise candidate who could unite the party's various factions. Chase was bitterly disappointed by his defeat. Despite his disappointment, Chase campaigned vigorously for Lincoln in the 1860 election. After Lincoln's victory, the president-elect offered Chase the position of Secretary of the Treasury. Chase accepted, seeing it as an opportunity to influence policy and perhaps position himself for a future presidential run. As Treasury Secretary, Chase faced the enormous challenge of financing the Civil War. The federal government needed unprecedented amounts of money to field armies and prosecute the war against the Confederacy. Chase had to develop new systems of taxation and borrowing to fund the war effort. Chase implemented several revolutionary financial policies during the Civil War. He established the first national banking system, creating a uniform national currency backed by government bonds. Before the war, hundreds of different banks issued their own paper money, creating chaos in the financial system. Chase's national banking system brought order and stability to American finance. He also introduced the first federal income tax to help pay for the war. Chase oversaw the printing of paper money known as greenbacks, which were not backed by gold or silver but by the government's promise to pay. These greenbacks helped finance the Union war effort but also caused inflation. Chase was more than just Treasury Secretary. He constantly involved himself in military strategy, cabinet politics, and policy debates. He was ambitious and often clashed with other cabinet members, particularly Secretary of State William Seward. Chase believed he could do a better job as president than Lincoln. He criticized Lincoln's policies privately and sometimes publicly. Chase thought Lincoln was too slow to embrace emancipation and too willing to compromise with border state slaveholders. Chase pushed Lincoln to make the abolition of slavery a war aim from the beginning. In 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in rebel states would be free as of January 1, 1863. Chase had been urging Lincoln to take this step for months. While Chase supported the proclamation, he thought it didn't go far enough. He wanted immediate emancipation in all states, including the border states that remained loyal to the Union. Chase believed that ending slavery completely was both a moral imperative and a military necessity. Freed slaves could join the Union Army and help defeat the Confederacy. Chase's relationship with Lincoln was complicated and often tense. Chase repeatedly offered his resignation over various disputes, expecting Lincoln to refuse and beg him to stay. Lincoln usually did refuse, recognizing Chase's abilities and the difficulty of replacing him. But Chase also repeatedly undermined Lincoln, encouraging other Republicans to challenge the president's leadership. In 1864, Chase allowed his supporters to launch another presidential campaign against Lincoln. The Chase movement quickly collapsed when it became clear that Lincoln retained strong support within the Republican Party. Chase was humiliated by his failed challenge. In June 1864, Chase offered his resignation once again during a dispute over a patronage appointment. This time, Lincoln surprised everyone by accepting it. Chase had finally pushed too far. Lincoln had grown tired of Chase's constant scheming and disloyalty. For several months, Chase was out of government, though he continued to support the Union cause and campaigned for Lincoln's re-election. Despite their difficult relationship, Lincoln recognized Chase's talents and contributions to the war effort. In October 1864, Chief Justice Roger Taney died. Taney had served on the Supreme Court since 1836 and was infamous for writing the Dred Scott decision, which declared that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. Lincoln needed to appoint a new Chief Justice who would support the government's war measures and the legal changes brought about by emancipation. After considering several candidates, Lincoln appointed Salmon Chase as Chief Justice in December 1864. It was a magnanimous gesture toward a political rival. Chase was confirmed by the Senate and took his seat on the Supreme Court. As Chief Justice, Chase presided over a court that had to address the legal consequences of the Civil War and Reconstruction. The court heard cases involving the constitutionality of wartime measures, the rights of freed slaves, and the relationship between the federal government and the states. Chase generally supported a broad interpretation of federal power and the rights of African Americans. He believed the Constitution should be interpreted as a living document that could adapt to changing circumstances. One of the most important cases Chase presided over was Texas versus White in 1869. The case involved the question of whether Texas had legally seceded from the Union during the Civil War. Chase wrote the majority opinion, declaring that secession was unconstitutional and that the Union was perpetual and indissoluble. States could not unilaterally leave the Union. This decision established an important precedent about the nature of the American federal system. Chase argued that the Constitution created an indestructible union of indestructible states. In 1868, Chase presided over the impeachment trial of President Andrew Johnson. Johnson, who had become president after Lincoln's assassination, clashed repeatedly with congressional Republicans over Reconstruction policy. The House of Representatives impeached Johnson, and the Senate held a trial to determine whether to remove him from office. As Chief Justice, Chase was required to preside over the Senate during the trial. Chase conducted the proceedings with fairness and dignity, insisting on proper legal procedures. He angered some radical Republicans by refusing to let the trial become a purely political exercise. The Senate ultimately acquitted Johnson by a single vote. Chase never gave up his presidential ambitions, even while serving as Chief Justice. In 1868, he sought the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, a remarkable move for a man who had spent decades fighting slavery and had helped found the Republican Party. Chase believed he could unite the country and implement a moderate Reconstruction policy. He thought both parties had become too extreme and that the nation needed his steady leadership. But the Democrats nominated Horatio Seymour instead, and Chase's presidential dreams were finally dashed. Many people criticized Chase for seeking the presidency while serving as Chief Justice, seeing it as inappropriate and undignified. Chase continued to serve as Chief Justice until his death. He worked to strengthen the Supreme Court as an independent branch of government. Chase believed the court should be a check on both the executive and legislative branches. He expanded the court's role in protecting individual rights and limiting government power when it overstepped constitutional bounds. Chase was not always consistent in his judicial philosophy, sometimes supporting federal power and sometimes limiting it depending on the circumstances. His legacy on the court is mixed, but he helped guide the nation through the difficult legal questions raised by the Civil War and Reconstruction. Throughout his life, Chase was driven by ambition and principle in equal measure. He genuinely believed in the cause of human freedom and worked tirelessly to end slavery. But he also craved recognition and power, sometimes to the detriment of his relationships and reputation. Chase was brilliant, hardworking, and dedicated, but also vain, calculating, and disloyal. His contemporaries recognized his abilities but often distrusted his motives. Lincoln once said that Chase had the presidential fever so badly that it had affected his brain. Yet Lincoln also acknowledged that Chase was indispensable to the Union war effort. Chase's personal life remained marked by tragedy even in his later years. He outlived 3 wives and several of his children. His daughter Kate Chase Sprague was a prominent Washington socialite who had helped manage her father's political career. Kate was ambitious for her father and shared his presidential dreams. After marrying Senator William Sprague, Kate's own life became troubled by financial problems and marital difficulties. Chase found solace in his work and his remaining family, but the losses he endured left him a somewhat lonely and melancholic figure. On May 7, 1873, Salmon P. Chase died in New York City after suffering a stroke. He was 65 years old. Chase had lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in American history and had played a central role in many of the era's defining events. He had helped build the anti-slavery movement, create the Republican Party, finance the Civil War, and reshape the American legal system. His contributions to ending slavery and preserving the Union were immense. Chase was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in Washington, D.C., though his remains were later moved to Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. Chase's legacy is complicated. He was never as beloved as Lincoln or as celebrated as other Civil War leaders. His ambition and political scheming made him difficult to admire unreservedly. But his commitment to ending slavery was genuine and long-standing. Chase fought against slavery when it was politically unpopular and personally costly to do so. He used his legal skills to defend the defenseless and his political talents to build movements that changed the nation. Chase understood that ending slavery required working within the political system, building coalitions, and making strategic compromises. He was a pragmatic idealist who knew that moral principles had to be translated into practical politics to achieve real change. As Treasury Secretary, Chase's innovations transformed American finance. The national banking system he created lasted for decades and helped build a modern industrial economy. His financial policies during the Civil War were controversial but ultimately successful in funding the Union war effort. Without Chase's ability to raise money through taxes, bonds, and paper currency, the Union might not have been able to field the armies necessary to defeat the Confederacy. Chase's face appeared on various pieces of currency over the years, a fitting tribute to the man who revolutionized American finance. As Chief Justice, Chase helped establish important precedents about the nature of the Union and federal power. His decision in Texas versus White settled the question of secession definitively. Chase's court also began the long process of defining the legal meaning of the post-Civil War constitutional amendments that abolished slavery and guaranteed equal protection under law. Though the court would later retreat from protecting African American rights during the era of Jim Crow, Chase at least tried to give meaningful effect to the promises of Reconstruction. Salmon P. Chase was a man of contradictions. He was deeply religious yet politically calculating. He was principled yet ambitious. He fought for the rights of African Americans yet sometimes held paternalistic views about their capabilities. He was loyal to causes but disloyal to individuals. Chase represented both the best and worst of 19th-century American politics. He showed how moral conviction could drive political change, but also how personal ambition could corrupt noble purposes. In the end, Chase's contributions to ending slavery and preserving the Union outweigh his personal failings. He was never president, the position he so desperately wanted, but he shaped American history in profound ways nonetheless. Elijah Lovejoy was a Presbyterian minister and newspaper editor who became the first martyr of the American abolitionist movement. Elijah Parish Lovejoy was born in Albion, Maine on November 9, 1802. He came from a deeply religious family. His father Daniel Lovejoy was a congregational minister and farmer who instilled in his children a strong sense of moral duty and Christian values. Elijah was the eldest of 9 children and from an early age he showed exceptional intelligence and a passion for learning. The Lovejoy household was one of modest means but rich in faith and education. Young Elijah grew up in rural Maine during a time when the nation was still finding its identity, still working out the contradictions between the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the reality of human bondage that existed in the southern states. Elijah Lovejoy attended Waterville College, which is now known as Colby College, in Maine. He was an outstanding student, graduating at the top of his class in 1826. Lovejoy was known for his serious demeanor and his commitment to his studies. He was not one for frivolity or wasting time. After graduation, Lovejoy moved west to St. Louis, Missouri, seeking opportunity and adventure. St. Louis in the 1820s was a booming frontier city, a gateway to the West, a place where fortunes could be made and where the future seemed limitless. Lovejoy took a position as a school teacher and began to establish himself in this new environment. He was ambitious and hardworking, and he soon became involved in journalism, contributing articles to local newspapers. But something was missing in his life. He felt a spiritual emptiness, a lack of purpose that material success could not fill. In 1832, Elijah Lovejoy experienced a profound religious conversion. He attended a revival meeting and found himself deeply moved by the message he heard. He felt called by God to enter the ministry. Lovejoy returned east to study at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey, one of the most prestigious institutions for training Presbyterian ministers. At Princeton, Lovejoy immersed himself in theology and biblical studies. He was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1833. But Lovejoy did not see his calling as simply preaching from a pulpit on Sundays. He believed that Christianity demanded action, that faith without works was dead, and that a true Christian must confront the moral evils of society. He was increasingly troubled by the institution of slavery, which he saw as a fundamental violation of Christian principles and human dignity. After completing his studies, Lovejoy returned to St. Louis in 1833. He became the editor of a religious newspaper called the St. Louis Observer. The Observer was a weekly publication that focused on religious news, moral instruction, and commentary on social issues. Lovejoy used the newspaper as a platform to promote temperance, education, and Christian values. Initially, he was cautious about addressing the slavery question directly. St. Louis was a slave state, and Missouri was deeply divided on the issue. Many of the city's most prominent citizens owned slaves, and the economy was tied to the institution in various ways. But Lovejoy could not remain silent for long. His conscience would not allow it. He began to publish articles that questioned the morality of slavery, that suggested it was incompatible with Christian teaching, that argued for gradual emancipation. The reaction was swift and hostile. Pro-slavery forces in St. Louis were outraged by Lovejoy's editorials. They saw him as a dangerous agitator, a troublemaker from the North who was trying to stir up discord and threaten their way of life. In April 1836, a horrific event occurred that pushed Lovejoy to take an even stronger stand. A free black man named Francis McIntosh was arrested in St. Louis and accused of killing a deputy sheriff. Before he could be brought to trial, a mob seized McIntosh from the authorities, chained him to a tree, and burned him alive. The lynching was a barbaric act of mob violence, and Lovejoy was horrified. He wrote a powerful editorial condemning the murder and calling for justice. He criticized the judge who seemed to excuse the mob's actions. This was too much for the pro-slavery establishment in St. Louis. They wanted Lovejoy silenced. The threats against Lovejoy intensified. He received warnings that his life was in danger. Pro-slavery mobs began to target his newspaper office. In July 1836, while Lovejoy was away, a mob broke into the Observer's office and destroyed his printing press. The press was thrown into the Mississippi River. This was a deliberate act of intimidation, an attempt to shut down his newspaper and drive him out of Missouri. But Lovejoy refused to be intimidated. He was determined to continue his work. However, he realized that St. Louis was no longer safe for him or for his newspaper. He made the difficult decision to relocate across the Mississippi River to Alton, Illinois. Illinois was a free state, and Lovejoy believed he would have more protection for his rights there. He thought that in a free state, he would be able to exercise his constitutional right to freedom of the press without fear of mob violence. Elijah Lovejoy moved to Alton in the summer of 1836. He established a new newspaper called the Alton Observer. Alton was a small but growing river town located about 20 miles north of St. Louis. Although Illinois was technically a free state, many of its residents, especially those in the southern part of the state, had ties to the South and were sympathetic to slavery. Alton itself was divided on the slavery question. Some residents supported Lovejoy's right to publish his views, but many others saw him as a threat to social harmony and economic interests. The city's business leaders worried that Lovejoy's abolitionist rhetoric would damage Alton's commercial relationships with the South. They feared that Southern merchants would boycott Alton if the city became known as a hotbed of abolitionism. Lovejoy continued to publish articles opposing slavery in the Alton Observer. His tone became more forceful and uncompromising. He was no longer calling merely for gradual emancipation, he was demanding immediate abolition. He argued that slavery was a sin, that it corrupted both the enslaved and the enslaver, and that it had to be ended without delay. Lovejoy also began to advocate for other controversial causes. He supported the rights of free blacks, he criticized racial prejudice, and he called for equal treatment under the law. These positions made him extremely unpopular with many of Alton's residents. They saw him as a radical, a fanatic, someone who was willing to tear apart the social fabric for the sake of his principles. In August 1837, a mob attacked Lovejoy's newspaper office in Alton and destroyed his printing press. This was the second time his press had been destroyed. Lovejoy ordered a replacement press, but when it arrived in September, another mob broke into the warehouse where it was stored and threw it into the Mississippi River. This was the third press that had been destroyed. The attacks on Lovejoy's presses were not random acts of vandalism. They were organized efforts by pro-slavery forces to silence him and shut down his newspaper. The mobs believed they were defending their community against a dangerous outsider who threatened their values and their interests. Lovejoy could have given up at this point. He could have left Alton, moved further north, or abandoned journalism altogether. Many people urged him to do exactly that. Even some of his supporters suggested that he should moderate his views or stop publishing altogether for his own safety. But Lovejoy refused to back down. He believed deeply in the principle of freedom of the press. He saw it as a fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution, a right that could not be surrendered in the face of mob intimidation. He also believed he had a moral duty to speak out against slavery. He felt called by God to be a voice for the voiceless, to defend those who could not defend themselves. To remain silent would be to betray his faith and his conscience. Lovejoy ordered a fourth printing press. He and his supporters made plans to protect it when it arrived. They knew that another mob attack was likely, and they were determined to defend their property and their rights. A group of about 20 men, including Lovejoy, gathered at a warehouse on the night of November 7, 1837, to guard the new press. They were armed and prepared to resist any attempt to destroy it. Word spread through Alton that Lovejoy and his supporters were at the warehouse. A pro-slavery mob began to gather. The crowd grew larger and more aggressive as the night wore on. They demanded that Lovejoy surrender the press. They shouted threats and insults. The tension escalated. Around 10 o'clock that night, the mob attacked the warehouse. They threw rocks and fired shots at the building. Lovejoy and his defenders fired back, trying to protect themselves and the press. The mob brought a ladder and attempted to set fire to the roof of the warehouse. Elijah Lovejoy and another man stepped outside to push the ladder away. As Lovejoy stood in the doorway, he was struck by multiple gunshots. 5 bullets hit him. He staggered back inside and collapsed. His last words were, "My God, I am shot." Within minutes, Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was dead. He was just 34 years old, 2 days short of his 35th birthday. After killing Lovejoy, the mob broke into the warehouse and destroyed the fourth printing press. They threw it into the Mississippi River, just as they had done with the previous presses. Then the mob dispersed into the night. The murder of Elijah Lovejoy sent shockwaves through the nation. It became a defining moment in the abolitionist movement. Lovejoy was hailed as a martyr who had died defending freedom of the press and opposing slavery. His death galvanized many people who had been sitting on the fence about slavery. It showed them the violence and brutality that lay at the heart of the pro-slavery cause. It demonstrated that slavery's defenders were willing to use murder to silence their critics. News of Lovejoy's murder spread quickly. Abolitionist newspapers published accounts of his death. Public meetings were held in cities across the North to condemn the killing and honor Lovejoy's memory. many people who had been indifferent to the slavery question were moved to action by Lovejoy's martyrdom. The murder helped to transform abolitionism from a fringe movement into a more mainstream cause. It showed that the conflict over slavery was not just about abstract principles or distant plantations in the South. It was about fundamental American rights, about whether free speech and free press could survive in a nation divided over slavery. One person who was profoundly affected by Lovejoy's death was a young lawyer in Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was 28 years old at the time, serving in the Illinois state legislature. He was not yet an abolitionist, but he was troubled by the mob violence that had killed Lovejoy. Lincoln gave a speech in January 1838, just 2 months after Lovejoy's murder, in which he warned about the danger of mob rule and the importance of respect for law. Although Lincoln did not mention Lovejoy by name, historians believe that Lovejoy's murder was very much on his mind when he delivered that speech. Years later, as president, Lincoln would lead the nation through a civil war that would finally end slavery. Another person deeply influenced by Lovejoy's death was a young man named John Brown. Brown was a fervent abolitionist who believed that slavery could only be ended through violence. When Brown heard about Lovejoy's murder, he stood up in church and publicly dedicated his life to destroying slavery. Brown would go on to lead the raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, an event that further pushed the nation toward civil war. The connection between Lovejoy's martyrdom and Brown's radicalization shows how Lovejoy's death reverberated through the years leading up to the Civil War. After Lovejoy's death, there was a brief attempt to hold his killers accountable. Several men were arrested and charged with rioting, but not with murder. The trial was a farce. The defendants were quickly acquitted. The jury and the community seemed to believe that Lovejoy had brought his fate upon himself by refusing to moderate his views. This failure of justice only added to the outrage felt by abolitionists in the North. It confirmed their belief that slavery had corrupted not just the South but also parts of the North, that it had created a culture of lawlessness and violence that threatened everyone's freedom. Elijah Lovejoy left behind a wife and a young son. His widow Celia Ann Lovejoy was pregnant with their second child when Elijah was killed. She gave birth to a son a few months after his death. Celia Ann struggled financially after losing her husband. The abolitionist community rallied to support her, raising money for her and her children. She eventually remarried and lived until 1874. Lovejoy's children grew up knowing their father as a hero and a martyr. His son Edward Payson Lovejoy became a minister like his father. Lovejoy's younger brother Owen Lovejoy was also deeply affected by Elijah's murder. Owen had been with Elijah in Alton during those dangerous months. He was there when Elijah was killed. Owen vowed over his brother's grave that he would dedicate his life to fighting slavery. Owen Lovejoy became a prominent abolitionist and a congressman from Illinois. He was a close friend and ally of Abraham Lincoln. Owen used his position in Congress to advocate for anti-slavery policies and to keep his brother's memory alive. He frequently spoke about Elijah's martyrdom and what it represented in the struggle for freedom. The warehouse where Elijah Lovejoy was killed no longer stands. The site is now marked by a monument commemorating his sacrifice. In Alton, Illinois, there are several memorials to Lovejoy. The Lovejoy Monument, a tall granite column topped with a statue, was erected in 1897 in the Alton Cemetery where Lovejoy is buried. The monument recognizes Lovejoy as a defender of freedom of the press and a martyr to liberty. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in Lovejoy's story and his significance in American history. Elijah Lovejoy's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He is remembered primarily as a martyr to the causes of freedom of the press and abolition. His willingness to die rather than surrender his principles made him a powerful symbol for those fighting against slavery. But Lovejoy was not simply a symbol, he was a real person with strengths and flaws. Some historians have noted that Lovejoy could be stubborn and uncompromising, that he sometimes seemed more concerned with principle than with practical consequences. His refusal to moderate his views or relocate to a safer place arguably led to his death and left his wife and children without a husband and father. Others argue that this criticism misses the point. They contend that moral courage sometimes requires exactly the kind of uncompromising stance that Lovejoy took. In their view, Lovejoy understood that certain principles are worth dying for, that freedom of speech and human dignity are not negotiable. If everyone had taken the safe and moderate path, slavery might have lasted even longer than it did. Lovejoy's martyrdom helped to inspire a generation of abolitionists who refused to compromise with evil. His death showed that the conflict over slavery was fundamentally a moral issue that could not be resolved through political maneuvering or gradual reform. Lovejoy's commitment to freedom of the press has particular resonance in modern times. He believed that a free press was essential to democracy, that citizens needed access to diverse viewpoints and vigorous debate in order to make informed decisions. He was willing to die defending that principle. In an era when freedom of the press is under threat in many parts of the world, and when journalists are sometimes killed for doing their work, Lovejoy's example remains relevant. He reminds us that press freedom is not an abstract concept but a concrete right that must be actively defended, sometimes at great personal cost. The story of Elijah Lovejoy also highlights the deep divisions that existed in America over slavery in the decades before the Civil War. These divisions were not just between North and South but also within northern states and communities. Alton, Illinois, a town in a free state, was nevertheless deeply hostile to abolitionism. Many Northerners were willing to tolerate slavery in the South in order to preserve national unity and protect their economic interests. They saw abolitionists like Lovejoy as troublemakers who were disrupting social harmony. This attitude of compromise and accommodation with slavery was exactly what Lovejoy refused to accept. He believed that slavery was evil and had to be opposed, regardless of the consequences. Lovejoy's religious faith was central to his abolitionism. He did not oppose slavery primarily on political or economic grounds but on moral and theological grounds. He believed that all human beings were created in the image of God and therefore possessed inherent dignity and worth. Slavery violated this fundamental truth by treating human beings as property. For Lovejoy, opposing slavery was not a political choice but a religious obligation. He saw himself as doing God's work, as being faithful to the gospel message. This religious dimension of his abolitionism gave him strength and conviction but also made him seem fanatical to those who did not share his faith or his interpretation of Christian teaching. The question of violence in Lovejoy's story is also worth considering. Lovejoy himself was not a violent man. He did not advocate armed rebellion against slavery. His weapon was the printing press, not the gun. However, on the night he was killed, he and his supporters were armed and prepared to use force to defend their property. This has led to some debate about whether Lovejoy was truly a pacifist or whether he believed that violence was justified in self-defense. Most historians conclude that Lovejoy believed in defending himself and his property against mob violence but did not support offensive violence or armed insurrection. He saw himself as exercising his legal and constitutional rights, not as starting a war. The failure of local and state authorities to protect Lovejoy is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. The mayor of Alton and other officials were aware of the threats against Lovejoy. They knew that mobs had already destroyed 3 of his printing presses. Yet they did little to protect him or to hold the perpetrators accountable. After his murder, the authorities made only a half-hearted attempt to prosecute his killers, and the defendants were quickly acquitted. This failure of the rule of law showed that in communities where slavery was supported or tolerated, even basic rights could not be guaranteed. It demonstrated that the conflict over slavery was not just about the South but about whether free institutions could survive anywhere in a nation divided over such a fundamental moral issue. Elijah Lovejoy's death was not in vain. His martyrdom energized the abolitionist movement and helped to move the nation toward confronting the evil of slavery. It took another 24 years and a bloody civil war before slavery was finally abolished, but Lovejoy's sacrifice was part of the long chain of events that led to that outcome. He showed that some principles are worth dying for, that freedom and human dignity are not negotiable. His example inspired others to take up the cause and to continue the fight. In that sense, Lovejoy's death was not an ending but a beginning, not a defeat but a victory for the cause to which he had dedicated his life.